Вітаємо всіх в нашому
Welcome everyone to our program Black Sky Stop Fake. Today we will talk about another type of Russian weapon, a weapon directed primarily against human souls.
Перш за все на душі людей.
We will debunk Moscow's fake information that Ukraine is a Satanist state. Let's begin.
Україна є сатанинською державою. Отже, починаємо. Сьогодні зі мною її будуть
Today's program will be hosted by my colleagues Wojciech Jankowski in Warsaw and Artur Jak in Lviv. Russian narratives about Ukraine being a satanic state are nothing new. To be honest, they only make me smile and want to mock them. However, it must be admitted that, as statistics confirm, unfortunately, many people are fooled by this false Russian information. They claim that Ukraine, its government, and most Ukrainians are satanic beings who do not respect the true church. And the true church, as the Russians claim, is only the Russian Orthodox Church and its Ukrainian branch, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Russian propaganda also claims that there is currently a terrifying persecution of the Moscow Patriarchate Church in Ukraine. Churches are being closed, monasteries are being liquidated, the Pochev and Pochev Lavras are being destroyed, and so on. I repeat, these false accusations only make me angry and laugh. Unfortunately, however, there is a large group of people in Ukraine itself who believe this and are being fooled. Today, we will try to debunk this Russian myth. Well, I would like to quote a fragment of the Kremlin's methodology, which was sent to pro-Russian media in 2023. In it, we find the following words: Nazi Satanists have entrenched themselves in the holy Russian city of Kiev, where Russes was baptized. Russia has stood up for Orthodox Christianity and is destroying neo-Nazis who worship the occult ideas of Hitler and Bandera on the front lines. At this point, I can only say, he who lives in glass houses should not throw stones. Take, for example, the leadership of the private military company Wagner. They are openly Nazis. Let us recall, for example, Prigozhin's deputy, Utkin, who had swastikas tattooed on his body and showed them off without embarrassment. Let us also recall Alexei Milchakov, the leader of the Rusik formation, a completely neo-Nazi group. Milchakov is famous for his brutal acts. He tormented, tortured, and killed dogs, cats, and other animals on camera. His followers then replicated these atrocities against Ukrainian prisoners of war. I cannot recall any video, any recording in which we would see Ukrainians killing Russian prisoners of war. And yet, we have literal evidence that Russians are beheading Ukrainian prisoners of war. killing them with knives, and there is even a recording in which they use an office knife to cut off our soldiers' genitals. All this is happening in front of cameras and is being shown to the public. I ask myself, are these the actions of defenders of good, defenders of all that is clear? After all, this is supposed to be completely Christian, right? In fact, such claims are completely rotten at their core.
Нашим воякам. І все це робиться на камеру, і все це показується. І мені цікаво, це
It is also necessary to explain what is happening with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. Last year, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine passed a law according to which all religious organizations had 9 months to prove that they had no ties to the Russian Orthodox Church. This was done primarily to enable the parishioners of the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate to make a peaceful and civilized transition to the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine.
Засвідчити те, довести те, що вони не мають ніяких зв'язків із
I repeat, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate was given 9 months to prove that it is not a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church. This deadline expired at the end of May this year. It is now mid-July, and the Ukrainian government has still not resolved the issue of the formal liquidation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. Does this not indicate excessive, even excessive tolerance towards this structure? Towards a church that is openly hostile to the Ukrainian state?
УПЦ МП в Україні. Чи це не говорить про надмірну навіть толеранцію стосовно цієї
What is happening in the Pecherska Lavra here in Kiev? I visit there often. The lower Lavra, the part where the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate Monastery is located, is closed to pilgrims and the faithful. Monks of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate still reside in the monastery, and they are not leaving. They are threatening to barricade themselves in and not leave the buildings.
Вони не виходять звідти, вони погрожують, що вони там будуть себе приковувати.
The government and the police not wanting to give the Kremlin propaganda a pretext to talk about the persecution of the Moscow Patriarchate are resolving the matter in a civilized manner through the courts. They want to eventually remove this community from the monastery because they are occupying the place illegally. The facts have already been confirmed by numerous court rulings.
Dmitro, before we move on to contemporary courts, let me tell you a story. I will not talk about the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in Tsarist Russia or its Stalinist church during World War II, even if I wanted to. there would not be enough space. I will only mention that such a structure was created externally for orthodoxy by Stalin. I would call it the Stalinist Church. But now I will move on to the history of independent Ukraine. From the very first years of independence, the Russian Church, Moscow Patriarchate, in Ukraine, built a very dense network of parishes, taking over what remained from the Soviet era. Let us recall that the Russian Orthodox Church was almost the only official religious institution in the Soviet Union, including the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. In this way, its parishes became a channel for the export of certain ideological myths. I am talking about three main myths. The first is the myth of Triune Rus, which dates back to the days of the Tsarist Empire. The cult of the Tsar Father was also propagated. According to it, there is a Tsar Father in Moscow who rules all Slavic lands. It is also worth mentioning that Russians very often consider only Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians to be Slavs. It was then that the concept of the Russian world, Ruski Mir, began to take shape as a holy, quasi-religious power, or even a superpower. This myth is well known. Dmytro and Wojciech, you probably also remember that the Kremlin established various social organizations at Orthodox churches. There were, for example, Lukyanik's Union of Orthodox Brotherhoods, Daniel Kaur's One Fatherland, Vasily Selovanov's Faithful Cossacks. All of them had the task of recruiting people and preventing them from transferring from the Moscow Patriarchate to the Kiev Patriarchate. Already in 2004, these people supported Viktor Yanukovych. They organized prayers for him in all parishes of the UCP PM, distributed leaflets, etc. Later, in 2010 to 2013, they moved from agitation, i.e., disinformation warfare, to overt sabotage. At that time, unofficial Orthodox units were formed. For example, in Kyiv itself, at the Pечерська Лавра. It is also worth mentioning the 2014 operation, Gifts of the Three Kings, which aimed to bring alleged gifts for the Orthodox Church to Crimea. At the same time, a pro-Russian Orthodox pilgrim, Igor Gherkin, later known as Strelkov, arrived in Crimea in 2014 under the pretext of an Orthodox pilgrimage. This is an example of how the church hierarchy and monastic conventions, such as the Sviatohirsk Lavra, were used to support separation and collaborationist activities in Crimea and Donbass. This can be called the so-called monastic base factor. It is also worth mentioning a certain paradox. I have never been a supporter of the claim that the Moscow Patriarchate is the canonical patriarchate of the Orthodox Church, but that is another story. The fact is that the Moscow hierarchy has long promoted the idea that both Ukraine and Russia are one Orthodox family, and the World Russian People's Council, if I remember correctly, its 25th council was held in March 2024, formulated this ideology of the Russian world as a kind of worldview Nazism. This is the narrative that Russia is the Katechon, the restrainer, while the rest of the world is the satanic West. After February 24th, 2022, people began to talk about the theology of war, that the invasion is a holy war, waged not only militarily, but also ideologically and pseudo-religiously. Dmytro, you rightly mentioned Rusik. Among its members are many who are fascinated by neo-fascist ideas. as well as a large group of neo-paganists. At the same time, there are quite a few armed groups of a very conservative, Orthodox Christian nature operating on the side of the Russian army and among the pro-Russian separatist collaborator units. Worse still, these same forces are also targeting Western public opinion. They write that Christians are allegedly discriminated against in Ukraine, cleverly confusing Orthodox Christianity with Christianity itself. In their understanding, other Christian denominations are often not recognized as true Christianity. They are treated as heretical or hostile.
Arthur, it is worth saying that what you are saying about the three fronts of the struggle also translates into the export of this narrative to the West. They export it to Western Europe, the United States, and other countries that see themselves as Christian in our understanding. The problem is that this struggle, the struggle of the Orthodox Russian conservative forces, is not only taking place in Ukraine, which we have discussed. It is also taking place in the West. In other words, these players are trying to sell the image of Russia as a conservative, orthodox country, thereby influencing conservative and right-wing circles around the world. Unfortunately, this influence can be considerable and significant.
Yes, for example, in 2023, a resolution to grant aid to Ukraine in the U.S. Congress was blocked by Congressman Mike Johnson, a very conservative Christian politician. He said he would not support the aid because he believed that Ukraine allegedly discriminated against Christians. It was only thanks to the hard work of Ukrainian Protestants of various denominations that Johnson changed his mind. They traveled to the U.S., convinced Americans, and showed evidence of how much they themselves had suffered since 2014. In many places in Donbass and Crimea, there were many Protestants who paid for their faith with their lives or health. Such Orthodox Cossacks, or whatever they are called there, treated them as heretics or Satanists. These reports influenced Western awareness. For example, Pastor Mark Burns, a well-known clergyman in the U.S., often referred to as Donald Trump's chief pastor, came to visit us. Burns had previously been skeptical about helping Ukraine, admitting that he believed the U.S. should not support a country that persecutes Christians. But when he visited Ukraine, at the invitation of the chief rabbi of Ukraine, Moshe Reuven Assman, through the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches,
of the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches.
Thank you, Dimitro. Burns saw the truth with his own eyes. He met with clergy of various denominations and visited places where the Russian army had committed crimes. Now he is one of the most ardent advocates of aid to Ukraine. Almost every day, through social media, he appeals to Americans and their politicians for support for our country. Thanks to such actions, both by Ukrainian pacifists and believers such as Pastor Burns, We are gradually countering the Kremlin's disinformation. It must also be said that there are many pro-Russian speakers in the Western information space. They are mainly English-speaking people from the US and Europe. Perhaps the best known is Tucker Carlson. In my opinion, he perfectly conveys what the Russian Orthodox Church and the Kremlin are saying. Today, it is really difficult to separate the Russian Orthodox Church from the Kremlin itself. For many, it is simply one of the towers of the Kremlin. We often talk about different towers of the Kremlin that are supposedly fighting each other, but in my opinion, this is a myth. These towers form a single coherent structure.
Okay, Arthur. What do you think can be done to counter this? How can we counteract this in order to reach people with the truth?
We have a serious problem here, and we need to separate two aspects of our activities, internal and external. Regarding Ukraine itself, we need to work more with the local community. It makes my blood boil when I think that there are still Russian merchants in Pochev today, and supporters of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate are occupying the monastery there, allegedly since the January uprising. Dimitro, correct me if I'm wrong, but apparently the Basilian monastery was liquidated at that time.
The November uprising.
Among the local population, this place still has many defenders, especially in western Ukraine. I understand that it is difficult for ordinary believers to leave their own parish or church, which they have been attending all their lives. I also understand some priests. They had a stable life with the Moscow Patriarchate. But people need to be made aware that this is a very destructive and corrupt organization. It is a structure that is stronger and more influential than all the sects of the 1990s, such as the White Brotherhood and other cults. There is an opinion that it was the structures of the KGB, and later the FSB and SWR-FR, that helped build this network of sects, which are still active today. There are many pro-Russian religious movements in Ukraine.
Артуре, я перепрошую, я бачу, що тут не початий
Yes, Arthur. I can see that there is a lot of work to be done here. I think it is impossible to solve everything in an instant.
І думаю, що ми в один раз, звісно ж, не впишемось. Я лише хотів на сам кінець запитати Войка.
I would like to add one more important thing. Since we are talking about this narrative that is being conveyed to the West, to Europe, the US, and Anglo-Saxon countries, it should be emphasized that it also reaches us in Poland. Not long ago, just a few months, I listened to a radio interview with the editor-in-chief of a very conservative magazine. He talked about the granting of the tomos to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in such a way that he said that the entire church had been invented and created by Poroshenko. For a moment I thought he was talking about some kind of neo-Protestant movement, but then it turned out that he was referring to Orthodox autocephaly in Ukraine. His statement did not contain a single word about the true tradition or history of Orthodoxy in Ukrainian lands. Instead, it was full of accusations that Orthodox Christians were allegedly being persecuted in Ukraine. I simply heard the entire Russian narrative in the Polish version. I was shocked that someone in Poland, in my country, would approach these stories so uncritically?
Wojciech, sorry to interrupt. You mentioned publicists and journalists, but we also have our Orthodox Church in Poland, formerly Autocephalous. But it should be remembered that its current structure was established during Stalin's time, when the older, canonical Polish autocephaly was abolished. Since then, a new Orthodox organization has been in place, and it is this organization, the Polish Orthodox Church, that calls the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the autocephalous one, uncanonical, heretical, and unchristian. In other words, the Poles themselves, whose Orthodox Church is also heavily dependent on Moscow, are repeating the Kremlin's narrative. This shows how much this propaganda narrative has poisoned various religious structures in the West. It is like a cancer that has eaten deep into various institutions. Just as we did a report on Belarusian monks selling gadgets to support the so-called special military operation, so too in Poland some groups were involved in similar activities. So we are dealing not only with propaganda wars, but also with practical support for the war on the part of religious activists.
That's right. I once spoke with journalists from the Belarusian website Vot Tak. They described just such cases, Belarusian nuns who come to Poland, for example, to Catholic fairs and sell various gadgets. They found out that the money collected in this way goes to support the Russian army. They showed how many Catholics and ordinary people thought these religious collections were innocent, while in fact the money was going to the Russians for weapons.
Friends, we are ending today's episode. Unfortunately, this is a very broad topic and we will return to it often because we must continue to fight this propaganda. Ultimately, we must overthrow the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, which is absolutely hostile to Ukrainian independence. In short, we must finally defeat Russian propaganda. Thank you for being with us. Follow our program, Black Sky, Stop Fake. See you in the next episode.
І до наступних зустрічей.